There was a body under my bed, and nobody believed me. I was 12 years old when it happened. I'd been counting my marbles, lining them up one by one, when my tiger's eye rolled under the bed. Without thinking, I reached down to grab it. My fingers didn't meet the cool glass of my marble. They brushed against something else. Something cold. It was a hand. At 12, the only hands I'd ever held were my parents', back when I was a little kid. I didn't need to guess what I'd touched. That icy grip sent a jolt straight through me. I yanked my hand back like I'd been burned and scrambled into the farthest corner of my room. My heart hammered in my chest. After a moment, when I finally worked up the nerve, I dropped to my hands and knees and peered under the bed. And then I saw them. The bluest eyes I'd ever seen stared back at me. Even now, I've never seen eyes so piercing, so unnervingly alive. That's the last thing I remember before everything went dark. When I came to, my parents were hovering over me, their faces tight with worry. My sister, Jill, stood off to the side, pale as a sheet. She told me I'd let out a blood-curdling scream and fainted. At first, it didn't make sense. Then the memory of what I'd seen hit me like a punch to the gut. "There's a body under my bed," I shouted. My parents didn't believe me. Of course they didn't. Who would? "It was just a bad dream," they said. "Your imagination is playing tricks on you." But I knew it wasn't. I couldn't let it go. I kept insisting until my dad finally gave in and decided to check. I sat on the couch, knees pulled up to my chest, hands clamped over my ears. I braced myself for my mom's scream, but it never came. When I cracked my eyes open, they were standing in front of me, looking irritated instead of horrified. "There's nothing there," my dad said flatly. "Stop this nonsense." Their reaction made me doubt myself. Maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe I really had dreamed it all up. That night, I avoided my room as long as I could, but my dad's no-nonsense glare left no room for argument. With shaky legs, I walked in. Everything looked normal. Felt normal. Even smelled normal. Relief trickled in, along with the exhaustion from the day's chaos. I quickly changed and crawled into bed, convincing myself it was over. Sleep came, but it didn't stay. The nightmares did. Those blue eyes haunted every dream, staring out from every face I saw. Strangers reached for me, grabbing my arms and clothes, their mouths moving like they were begging for help. I woke with a start, soaked in sweat. The room was pitch black, and the air felt heavy, wrong. I knew what I had to do. Reaching into the nightstand, I fumbled until my fingers found the flashlight. It flickered weakly when I smacked it on my palm. After a deep breath and a hurried pep talk, I told myself none of this was real. I slid off the bed and onto the floor. This time, I didn't scream. I didn't faint. She was still there. The same woman with those terrible, beautiful blue eyes. Her body was twisted in ways that didn't seem possible. Blood matted her hair and stained her torn clothes. But it was her face that froze me in place. The fear etched into her expression locked my breath in my throat. I couldn't move. I expected her to lunge at me, to drag me under the bed, just like in every horror movie I wasn't supposed to watch. But she didn't. She just stayed there, staring. When I finally managed to move, I crawled back into bed on trembling limbs. Pulling the covers over my head, I cried myself to sleep, whispering, "Why me?" And that was only the beginning. That morning, I woke up feeling groggy, my face crusted with dried tears. Sleep hadn't been kind, and the weight of the night lingered heavily on me. When I shuffled into the kitchen, I mumbled a half-hearted, "Good morning." My mom, standing at the stove flipping pancakes, responded without turning around. It wasn't until my dad, seated at the table, barked out, "What the hell happened to your face?" that I realized I was the center of attention. My mom turned to inspect me, her brow furrowing as she commented on my puffy, swollen eyes. Jill, never missing an opportunity to be the lovable pain she was, grinned and said I looked like something scraped off the bottom of a shoe. My dad silenced her with a stern glare. Without thinking, I blurted, "It was the woman under my bed." The room went still. Before I could say more, my dad cut me off sharply. He was a man who didn't tolerate nonsense, and once he made up his mind, there was no point arguing. He leaned across the table, his voice low and final. "This prank ends now. Do you hear me?" I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. Nobody said much after that. Breakfast carried on in tense silence, and everyone went about their day like nothing had happened. I knew better than to mention it again at home, but at school, that was a different story. Joey, my best friend since kindergarten, was the only person who believed me without question. We found an empty corner of the playground, and the brainstorming began. Joey, always the paranormal expert, stroked an imaginary beard and said, "She's gotta be a ghost. Some lost soul, stuck here." But I could feel her hand, I protested. "Not all ghosts are floaty or see-through," Joey said, leaning in like he was sharing top-secret information. "Sometimes, they're solid. It depends on how strong they are." I didn't fully understand, but his explanation felt more plausible than the idea that I'd imagined everything. We decided she was a lost spirit, trapped on Earth for some reason. The question was, why me? Why had she shown herself to a kid whose biggest worries were trading Pokemon cards and beating the next level in a video game? The rest of the day passed in a haze of questions. Should I try to talk to her? Get a Ouija board? Call a priest? What if my parents found out? I couldn't shake the feeling that I had to help her, even if I didn't know how. When I got home, the silence in the house was deafening. Mom and Dad wouldn't be back until the evening, and Jill had cheer practice, leaving me alone. Usually, I'd grab a snack, watch some TV, and then get my homework and chores done before my dad's inevitable inspection. But today wasn't usual. I had a mission. With shaky confidence, I walked into my room and stood by the bed. My heart raced as I counted down from 10. At 0, I dropped to the floor and looked. She was still there. The same piercing blue eyes stared out at me, but her body, it had changed. Her skin had started to dull, taking on a grayish hue. In some places, it sagged like it was barely clinging to her bones. In others, it stretched tight, giving her face a hollow, skeletal look. I didn't know much about death back then, but I'd seen enough dead animals in the woods to recognize decay. And then the smell hit me. It was a sickly sweet stench, the kind that claws its way into your nose and stays there. My stomach lurched. I barely made it to the bathroom before my lunch came back up. By the time Jill got home, I'd cleaned up, but that was about all I'd managed to do. She found me sitting on the couch, looking as pale as the ghost herself. "Why isn't your stuff done?" she asked, hands on her hips. "You know Dad's gonna lose it." "I can't," I whispered. "It's worse now." Her face shifted from annoyed to skeptical. "Worse? How?" I tried to explain, the smell, the decay, the fear, but Jill just sighed. Okay, I've had enough. I'm gonna prove to you there's nothing under your bed. She headed for my room, and panic surged through me. I sprinted after her, throwing myself in front of the door, arms spread wide. Don't! I begged. Please, don't open it. Jill stared at me, irritation softening into something closer to concern. The smell was seeping out from under the door now, faint but undeniable to me. How could she not notice? She hesitated, then gave a small nod. Fine, she said quietly, turning away. I watched her go, my legs trembling with relief. But deep down, I knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. My parents pulled into the driveway around 6, their headlights cutting through the early evening gloom. They shared a ride to and from work since we didn't have a family car, just my dad's work truck. On days when he had far-off jobs, my mom would catch a ride home with a coworker. Those days were small blessings, a brief reprieve from the storm that was my dad. The moment he stepped through the door, his gaze locked onto mine. My stomach clenched, and I swallowed hard, trying to beat his anger to the punch. I launched into a frantic explanation about the smell, the decay, and those piercing blue eyes under my bed. My words tumbled out in a desperate rush, but they only seemed to fuel his irritation. With a grunt, he grabbed my arm and dragged me toward my bedroom. His muttering was low and venomous, but I caught enough, wasting my time, stupid kid, phrases I'd heard too many times before. He flung the door open with such force that it rattled on its hinges, then lifted my bed off the ground like it weighed nothing. My dad was a big man, strong on an average day and superhuman in a rage. Through tear-blurred vision, I saw her. She was still there, her lifeless body contorted and decaying in that same haunting pose. The stench hit me full force, and I gagged, my knees buckling. But my dad didn't see her. He didn't smell her. Instead, he pulled me close, his face inches from mine. His voice was low and cold, the kind of voice that didn't need to yell to terrify. If you keep pulling these pranks, there'll be a body under this bed, and it'll be yours. He dropped me, turned, and left the room, slamming the door behind him. The rest of the evening passed in silence, as it always did after one of his outbursts. My family knew better than to make a sound. The last time Dad had lost his temper this badly, it had ended with the television shattered on the living room floor. We didn't talk for 2 days after that. That night, I lay in bed, my stomach churning from the smell. My gag reflex kicked in every few minutes, but I didn't dare leave the room. The stench was unbearable, but the thought of waking my father was worse. So, I cried, silent, shaky sobs that eventually lulled me into a fitful sleep. When sleep came, it brought nightmares. The woman's face appeared everywhere, her blue eyes filled with desperation and fear. Each dream painted the same horrifying scene: she was running through the woods, dodging tree limbs and stumbling over roots. Her breath came in panicked gasps, and her head whipped around, searching for whatever was chasing her. I could feel her terror. It was raw and overwhelming, the kind of fear I had only ever seen on TV, or in my family's eyes during one of Dad's worst moments. The dreams got worse. In one, the thing chasing her finally caught up. I'll spare you the details of what happened next, but it was brutal, the kind of violence that felt too real to be imagined. The desperation in her eyes was seared into my mind. Why was she showing me this? Why had she chosen me? I wasn't strong or brave. I was just a kid trying to survive my own nightmares. During the day, I tried to piece things together. I scoured local news websites, searching for missing person reports or stories of murdered women. Nothing came up. It was like she didn't exist. Meanwhile, my health was deteriorating. The sleepless nights, the constant smell, and the haunting dreams were taking their toll. My reflection in the mirror looked as gaunt and hollow as the ghost under my bed. My mom noticed. I could see it in the way her eyes lingered on me, her brows knitting together in concern. But she never said anything. My dad's sharp glares kept her silent, as they did the rest of us. Still, she found ways to help me in her quiet, defiant way. On nights when I was supposed to be punished without dinner, she'd sneak me a plate after everyone else had gone to bed. She saved me in more ways than one, though we both knew it was only a temporary reprieve. Every night, I checked under the bed, hoping she'd be gone, that her decaying body would finally dissolve into nothing. But she was always there, withering more each day, the smell growing worse, her presence inescapable. I didn't know how much longer I could take it. It ended on a sunny day, one of those rare moments when everything felt a little too bright, a little too normal. I hadn't checked under my bed in days. By then, the specter had mostly withered away, leaving behind little more than skeletal remains. Only her haunting blue eyes seemed immune to time, as vivid and piercing as ever. But when I finally worked up the nerve to peek beneath the bed, I saw nothing. Just a water bottle, a pair of socks, and a dusty baseball mitt. She was gone. Relief came first, washing over me in a wave, but it didn't last. Sadness followed, deeper and sharper than I expected. She had been real, I was certain of it. I didn't need proof. I felt it in my bones. What she'd shown me, the horrors she endured, were real, and the thought of anyone suffering like that was unbearable. For the first time in my life, I prayed. I prayed she had found peace. But as the day wore on, my sadness twisted into something else. Anxiety. It clawed at me, gnawing at the edges of my mind. I couldn't explain it, but I felt like something was wrong, like the story wasn't over. Just after lunch, my principal, Mr. Cash, appeared at my classroom door. His face was grim, and he motioned for me to follow him. My heart sank. I'd never been sent to his office before. As we walked, the silence between us was suffocating. When we reached his office, I saw my sister sitting inside. Her face was pale, her eyes red and swollen. Mr. Cash's usual cheerfulness was gone, replaced by an expression that sent chills down my spine. He told us there had been an incident and that our aunt was on her way to pick us up. My sister broke into sobs. I couldn't even process what he was saying. "Why isn't Mom coming to get us?" I asked, my voice trembling. Mr. Cash placed a heavy hand on my shoulder but said nothing. When my aunt arrived, she wouldn't tell us much. She said our parents were safe but that we'd be staying with her for a while. Her evasiveness only made my anxiety worse. My mind raced with dark possibilities. When we got to my aunt's house, my mom was sitting on the couch, staring blankly at the wall. Her face was pale and drawn, her eyes puffy and red. She pulled us into her arms, holding us tight. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Your father did a very, very bad thing," she said, her words trembling. "He won't be coming home anytime soon. Maybe not ever." She explained, haltingly, that my father had murdered a young woman during one of his so-called work trips. Her voice broke as she tried to shield us from the worst of the details, but the truth seeped through the cracks. My ghost girl wasn't a ghost anymore. Her name was Anna Elizabeth Collins. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I snuck into the living room and turned on the news. It didn't take long for her face to appear on the screen. Anna, just 19, stared back at me in her graduation photo, her jet-black cap and gown stark against her fair skin. Her eyes were the same, impossibly blue, filled with life and promise. The news anchor described how Anna had gone missing after catching rides with strangers to get around. Hikers found her body in the woods. The police had been tracking my father for weeks, waiting for him to slip up. DNA from a discarded cigarette had sealed his fate. As I stared at her photo, a strange sense of calm settled over me. She wasn't beneath my bed anymore. She wasn't in my dreams. Somehow, I knew she had found peace. But that night, the calm shattered. I woke in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat. At first, I thought it was a nightmare, but the room was too quiet, too still. A cold draft swept over me, and when I opened my eyes, she was there. Anna. She stood in the corner of the room, bathed in the same soft light as in my dreams. Her face was calm, almost serene, but her eyes burned with something new. It wasn't fear. It was rage. She didn't speak. She didn't move. But the air around her felt heavy, suffocating. My chest tightened, and I could barely breathe. Then she stepped closer. Her movements were slow, deliberate, and with each step, the room grew colder. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was frozen, paralyzed by her presence. She stopped at the foot of my bed, her gaze locking onto mine. "Your father isn't the only one," she whispered. Her voice was soft, but it echoed in my head, 1,000 voices speaking at once. And then she smiled. Not a kind smile. Not a peaceful one. It was sharp, predatory, filled with a knowing that chilled me to my core. "I'll see you soon," she said. And just like that, she was gone. The next morning, I found scratches on the floorboards where she had stood. Deep, jagged marks that hadn't been there before. The story wasn't over. It had only just begun.